In the last chapter, we learned about the first type of control structure, which are if statements. And that allows us to execute bits of code based on whether conditions are true or not. But what if instead of making choices like that, we instead want to have some action that happens over and over again? Well, that's what we'll need loops for. Loops allow us to execute a bit of code until a condition is satisfied. There are three main kinds of loops that we'll be looking at: while loops, for loops, and for each loops. Let's start out with while loops. I think they'll be the simplest. The format of a while loop is while, expression, in parentheses, just like the if statement, then execute a statement. And that expression is once again going to be a Boolean expression, just like in the if statement. So while something evaluates to being true, we're going to do something. Let's take a look at a practical example. So here's a sample bit of code. In this code, while our variable count is less than or equal to 10, as long as that evaluates to true, then execute the block of code within the curly braces, which is going to be to echo count to the browser and then to increment count. And we learned about incrementing earlier. So count will go up from, let's say it starts at 0, it would go up to 1 to 2 to 3, and it would stay true, and it would keep echoing out count to us until that statement in the expression becomes false, at which point count is equal to 11. Suddenly, that loop will end, and it'll move on with whatever code follows this while loop. That's the basic structure of a while loop. Let's actually open up a PHP file and try one for ourselves. So I'm going to go into my PHP sandbox, and I created a file earlier called basic.html that just has some basic HTML we can use as a starting point. And I'll save as on that document. And I'm going to call this one while loops. And then it's going to need the suffix PHP, and I'll save it in my PHP sandbox, while loops. And we'll go ahead and give it a name. We'll say loops : while in this case. Actually, I'll make it lowercase w because that's the way we're going to write it. Let's go ahead and look at that same bit we were just looking at, like this. Now, of course, I'm going to need a value for count. So let's start out count with an initial value of just 0. And I'm going to go ahead and add one more little improvement here, which is I'm just going to concatenate a comma and a space after count. So what's going to happen is it's going to have count as a value of 0. It'll reach the while loop. While will test whether or not 0 is less than or equal to 10. Since that's true, it will then output count to our browser, put a comma and a space after it, and then make count equal to 1. Now, count will be equal to 1, and it'll go back and test it again. Is count less than or equal to 10? Yes, it is. So it'll do the process again. It'll test again. Is 2 less than or equal to 10? Yes, it is. And it will keep that process going until finally count equals 11. And once count equals 11, it will no longer satisfy that condition of the while statement, and it will exit out of the loop, and it will drop down to the point at which the curly brace ends. That's the end of our loop, and it'll keep going with any other PHP code we happen to have below that. So let's go ahead and just try this out. Let's save that, and let's open up our browser. And remember, we want to navigate to http://localhost. If you're on a PC, that'll be great. On a Mac, you'll also want to add in your user directory, Kevin, and PHP sandbox is the folder we're working with, and while loops is the name of the file, .php. And sure enough, there we go. We get what we expected. We get 0 through 10. Now, pay careful attention to what happens at the end there, because when this exits, the value of count is equal to 11. And we can actually test that if we go down here and say echo. Let's go ahead and put a BR tag at the beginning of it. And then let's use the notation we haven't used in a while, where we'll use our braces followed by count. And we'll get it to tell us what count is equal to. In fact, let's go ahead and put count in front of it, just so we can be really clear. I'll save that. We'll come back. We'll reload it. And you'll see that count is equal to 11. So just be careful about that count actually has finally not satisfied this condition. So it means that it is actually one higher than 10. Of course, I could have taken away the equal sign and changed the equation that it was looking for there. But in a loop like this, count will always have incremented past our condition. The second thing you'll want to be careful of with loops is to watch out for infinite loops. For example, what if count was never false, and it would always keep going and keep going and keep going, then our loop would just keep going and keep going and keep going, and it would keep trying to spit out things to our web server until finally our web server says, all right, I'm out of memory. You've given me way too much information. That's called an infinite loop. It just loops infinitely. So we want to make sure that at some point our conditions will be satisfied. The loop is going to end. Now, we can also put in if-then statements the same way that we did before. Let's go ahead and make one of those now. I'm going to put in a BR tag, and then I'm just going to paste all of that code that we were just working with. So it's actually going to reestablish count as being 0 at the top of it. But then, instead of just echoing it, let's say if, let's say count is equal to 5, then we're going to echo back. Let's just put in the word 5 in all caps. That'll give us a nice clear indication. And then I'll say else. I'll make my else statement be to echo the count the normal way. So we should know what this is going to do. Take a look at it if you're not clear. Just spend a second with it. We're going to have an if statement that's only going to execute when count is equal to 5, and it's going to do something else when count is not equal to 5. This count increment is going to happen regardless of the value of count, and all of that is going to take place inside of the loop. So let's go back and let's load that up. And there you'll see what we get. Is that what you were expecting? It went through the loop, got 0 through 4. When it hit 5, it came back with the big 5 written, and then it kept going with the rest of the loop until it finished satisfying this set of conditions. Okay, so we got 2 set of conditions going on here, doing 2 different things. And that's going to be extremely useful for us while we keep working. Let's move on to the next type of loop, which is going to be the for loop. The syntax is going to be a little more complex, but I think you'll also find it useful. And we'll start that right in the next movie.